So I'm going to attempt to reconstruct the elements of the story in a linear fashion from putting together all the different bits of the Quran, right? We're going to start before Mary. So the Quran has a story, going back to what you said about being dedicated. A son has to be dedicated to God in the temple, right? So the Quran has a story about how Mary's mother prays to God for a child, a holy child, that she's going to dedicate to him, to God, right? And the child is born, and she had assumed it was going to be a boy, but it's a girl. And so she's startled. And she said, what am I supposed to do this? And God said, well, I've accepted the dedication. So she's going to be special, right? She's different. So this is important. From the very birth, Mary is different in Islam, right?
This just made me understand your short film a little bit better. The one that you made.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's important to me, right? So, but okay. So Mary is different. Now, the Quran, Mary is very important in the Quran. The Quran states that she is unlike any other woman in the world. She is the highest of all women. She's of the entire universe, of all the worlds. So the Quran gives her that status, right? There's actually one of the chapters of the Quran is named after her, in which a lot of the story is present, along with other stories, right? And so Mary is exalted. She's the only woman mentioned by name in the Quran, by name. There's 4 holy women mentioned in the Quran. Mary is one of them. The other 3 are not mentioned by name. It's actually Pharaoh's wife is actually seen as a believer who protected Moses against Pharaoh. She doesn't have a name in the Quran, but she's seen as one of the holy women, right? And so, but Mary is named. Mary's named. And so Mary's born already at the pinnacle. And this is not in the Quran, but in early Islamic tradition, Mary was said to be born perfectly pure. There's a prophetic story, an oral tradition, where the prophet is supposed to have said that every baby is born crying because at the moment of birth, Satan comes and touches it. So it's not exactly original sin, but the idea is once you enter the world, you're immediately confronted with evil, and Satan is trying to get to you. So every baby cries. Mary didn't cry when she's born. And she was born
the
with
Immaculate Conception is part of this.
Yes, the Immaculate Conception is part of Islam. Yeah. So because
she has a miraculous birth as well. That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, she's a chosen person, and she's not like other people. So she's not born with that little dot. And the story is actually important because in that early, remember I told the early history we have of the Prophet Muhammad? So there's a story about how as a child, he is living with his foster brother out in the desert. And one day they come back late at night, and the foster mother who's taking care of him, because his own family and his father died, his mother died, he was an orphan for most of his life, right? And so his foster mother's taking care of him, and she sees that her son is terrified, and Muhammad, the little child, is like shaking and all white, like all the blood has left his face. And she asks what happened, and her son tells her, we were out playing, and these 2 men in white, physical beings, angels, 2 men in white came, and they suddenly grabbed, toddler Muhammad, child Muhammad. They grabbed him and they threw him on the ground, and they cut open his chest and took his heart out in front of me. And they went in with a tub of snow, and they cleaned the heart to take out that little dot from Satan, right? It was born with it, because everyone's born with a dot, little touch of Satan. And it's cleaned out, and his heart is put back in. Right, and then he's released, and the child is in shock, and the boy who saw it is in shock, and the foster mother's like, well, what is this crazy story, right? So that's in one of the earliest Islamic stories. So again, Mary doesn't have the dot, so she's born perfectly pure, Immaculate Conception. So that's the beginning of the Quranic account linearly, right? Then what happens is, then she is dedicated to the temple, but women, and you can research, women really aren't dedicated to the temple at this time, right? So she is basically given an exception as being like a holy woman that's allowed to be in the temple in the areas where the men are not, right? Because she's seen by other people as something special. And then the men start arguing about, like, this woman is special. I want to be her guardian, And so and a lot of them don't have her best interest in heart, right? They want to have the special child for themselves for possibly nefarious reasons. And so then what God says to them, and, and this is a tradition that exists in first century Judaism. We know it, that they would make decisions essentially by I Ching lots, that they would throw lots, divination. So they do a divination, and the divination comes up, and essentially Zechariah is given charge of the child. So Zechariah, right? So Zechariah, then we've got
in Luke's gospel, Zechariah, or it's Elizabeth, is a relative of
and that's possible in the Quran. There's no contradiction to that. She could, the interesting, in fact, one of the things I think she was is, and actually this is interesting because I actually don't believe that the Quranic Jesus is a descendant of David. I don't think it's there. And again, because remember, the gospel writers are trying to convince everyone he's a descendant of David because people are suspicious of that. He's a dude from Galilee, right? What's his connection to David? You know,
We
I don't know.
start
I don't
with
get
the
it.
genealogy.
Well, even in the New
Right.
Testament, even in the New Testament, though, it's talking about Joseph's genealogy, but he's not
Correct. It
supposed
doesn't link to her.
He shouldn't have had any genes from Joseph.
Which is odd, right? Yes, let's start with
It
the
is odd, and
genealogy
Christians
of
have made all kinds
Joseph
of
in his story, right? Yeah.
Yeah, in both Luke and Matthew, they're different genealogies, and both end with Joseph. You know, and so again, Mark doesn't bother, and John doesn't bother, right? Because it's not important to them. But these guys were trying to make some kind of point, right, about Jesus being connected to David, right, and Solomon, and I'm not so sure they are in the Quran. The reason is one of the chapters of the Quran that's very central, has the story of Jesus, is chapter 2, I believe. It's the family of Amram, who is the father of Moses. So the idea is that he is descended from Moses and Aaron, right? Because Mary is considered to be of the family of Amram from the Bible, and that so she would be a descendant of Aaronic priests, a priest of Aaron, right? Rather than from David, right? She'd be descended from Aaron. And what's interesting is that you do have early Christian sources that do say Mary was descended from Aaron. And then she also had a bloodline to David because they have to connect it. But this is an early account that we have. Early Christians believe Mary was from a priestly family, which would also explain why her mother's like, I dedicate my child to the temple, right? Because only the priests who could be descended of Aaron could be there in theory, right? And so he's probably not Davidic in the Quran. You know, he's probably a priestly descent. And the only other reference we have in Christianity that might support that, aside from these early legends about Mary, is that this figure that we're going to talk about, James, you know, we mentioned that, you know, he's apparently his brother. Apparently Mary had other children after Jesus, and James, who leads the Christians after Jesus. That's clear in the Acts of the Apostles. It's not Peter, it's James, right? Who is the brother of Christ. And we have early accounts of James would actually go into the temple and put on high priest robes and pray for the people. So he was like a shadow high priest. He was a political, that's why the high priest killed him, right? Because he's basically trying to take the high priest's political role. So how could he have done that unless he was already an Aaron priest descended? He couldn't have done it. So if that James' brother is a descendant of Aaron, Mary is a descendant of Aaron. So that fits in the Quranic story. So now we've got Zachariah in the Quran. Zachariah takes control of Mary, right? He's the one who's her guardian now, okay? Now, the next stage of the story is that Zachariah is taking care of her. She's being raised in a separate part of the temple in Jerusalem, where she has a private cell to herself, like the male priests do, and she's kept secluded in there. She puts up a veil, a curtain to protect herself from the men and being hassled by them. And the Quran then says, so Zachariah keeps coming up and checking up on her as she's getting older and living in this little private cell of hers, right? Almost like a monk. She's like a nun living there by herself, and she keeps finding fresh food there, and fruits that are out of season, like, you know, fruits that shouldn't be in winter are suddenly in her room. And she's like, where are you getting them? And she says, well, an angel appears and gives me this food from God, right? And so that's a story in the Quran. And so this is what Zachariah is blown away by this in the Quran. He's like, wow. I mean, you know, he's seeing this food that shouldn't be there. There's something special about this girl. And he's sad because he's an old guy who has no children. So the next stage of the Quranic story is Zachariah then prays to God for a son. And then an angel appears and says, your prayer has been answered, right? And not a dream, a physical angel appears and says, your prayer has been answered. And Zachariah's response is like, really? I mean, I was just asking that, but my wife's like really old. That's his response. My wife's really, is that, I mean, are you sure it's been answered? Because I mean, I was just asking that, right? and then the angel tells him, yes, your prayer has been answered. And yes, your wife is old and she's going to bear the child. And you're going to call him John. And it's interesting, the Quranic name for John, in Hebrew it's Yohanan, right? The Quranic name for John is Yahya. Yahya literally translates to he lives. That's interesting because remember, John is a martyr. He's executed by Herod, right? And one of the ideas of Islam is that a martyr is actually not dead. They're actually immortal. The moment you kill a martyr, they instantly become ontologically alive. They're not actually dead like other people. And so Yahya, who was martyred, is eternal, right? He lives, right? So he called him John. And then the angel says, but you will, and then Joseph asked for a sign. How do I know this is true? You're not pulling my leg. And the angel says, the sign will be that you will not speak to your people for 3 days. You will be unable to speak. So it's not a punishment. It's actually a proof. It's a proof. So it's a proof, and it's a proof to the people, because he says, go out and talk to them in signs. And so that's, it's like, already people are like, what's happening to Zechariah? He's a respected priest. He's acting strange. He can't talk. And then, then he'll tell them afterwards, when he can talk, it's because my son is going to be special. So now here's the interesting thing. So I've been to Jerusalem. I've been to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the site of where many people believe the Jewish temple was once, right? So in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, there are two areas that are designated for the story today. So there is a section of the mosque that is specifically dedicated to Zechariah's prayer. The Muslim belief is he was standing here or kneeling here and asking God for John at this exact spot. So that is still, you go to the Al-Aqsa Mosque today, that's still a designated spot that people go and pray in to get the blessings of that. So that's still a living tradition today that Zechariah did this, and he did it right here. And the other thing which blew me away is that there is a section underneath the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in the underground area of what Jews would call the Temple Mount. I would call it the Haram, but the area. You go there, and there is a cell that has stairs leading up to it, stone stairs, that's cut off completely from everything else. And the Muslim tradition is this is the room where Mary was raised in. And so the Ottomans later built like a beautiful, all these beautiful religious stuff inside that room. But yeah, so there's the room there that I've seen that Muslims say this is where these events happened. Okay, so so that's a living tradition. That's important.
Seems like you need some water with all the talking. You keep going.
I do. It's just cold.
Oh, yeah, cold. I forgot.
So the idea is, again, this will shock people. This is that important to Islam today that I've gone and prayed in the spot of Zechariah and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and I've been to the sacred room of Mary in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, right? So that's a living tradition today. That's how important the nativity story of the Quran is today. Okay. So now, next step in the linear story. So now this happens. And then John is born, right? And so he's going to have his own. And now you made this point. The Quranic story, when it starts talking about John, it immediately parallels the Jesus story, okay? And it uses the same phrases. Yeah, it uses the same phrases because John and Jesus are parallel, right? They're cousins. It's implied in the Quran. It's stated clearly in the New Testament, right? But what's interesting is they both use the same phrase. They both say, when talking about themselves, John and Jesus both use the same phrase in the Quran. They say that I've been blessed by God, and there's peace upon me when I was born, there's peace upon me when I live, and there'll be peace upon me when I'm raised back to life. So interesting that they both say this exact phrase. They use exact phrase.
Both, they're both martyrs, I assume?
Well, they're both, in a way. I mean, again, many Muslims, the Quranic verse is ambiguous. Many Muslims believe Jesus never died on the cross. Again, I told you, there were first century Christians that didn't believe Jesus died on the cross, right? We know Paul argued against them in Galatians 3. He said, don't listen to those people. Or why are you being silly? I've told you that Jesus died on the cross. So he says that in Galatians 3, right? So obviously some people are telling him he didn't die on the cross. So a lot of Muslims believe Jesus didn't die on the cross, but there's also a minority that interpret that verse to mean that he didn't die in the sense that John didn't die. Like John was beheaded by Herod, but he's immortal. He's Yahya. He lives, right? And the same way some minority Christian Muslims would say, no, Jesus did die on the cross, but you can't actually, once you've been martyred, you instantly become immortal, eternal life, right? And so there's a parallel. I'm not going to argue as to which interpretation is correct. They have their own theological implications. Okay, so now we've got this story. So now what happens is now we switch into the Mary story for real, okay? Now that we've established John and that they're going to be parallel, we now piece together the Mary story. So the Mary story is, so she's now living alone in that secluded chamber in the temple, now the Al-Aqsa Mosque. She's living there. It's funny because when I went to visit, I was with a guy who's an architect. From Miami, we were together, and he checked out the stones in that structure. He's like, no, this is absolutely a Roman construction. So whatever that room was used for, it absolutely exists from Jesus's time. He's like, this whole thing is Roman. The entire room is Roman architecture, right? So that room definitely lives at least to Jesus's time. We know that, right? So, and he saw, he's like, look at that. That's all Roman. So, all right. So now we've got this. Now, the next part of the story is, so Mary is living alone there, and then one day, God sends an angel, as the Quran says, in the form of a perfected man. Like he's beautiful, perfect, but he's physical form. And he arrives.
It said physical proportion, and one of the things you read, and then perfected man. I was like, what does that mean? So yeah, physically perfect man. I thought that was fantastic.
Physically perfect man, right? And there's also Sufi mystical meanings about perfected man that is more theological, but he appears in this form, and he breaks the segregation that she's got going on there, like her protected area, and he comes into her room. And she's shocked because the rule is no man ever bothers her, right? That's the rule for her to be in this area, that she's been given this thing. And so she immediately says, I take refuge in God, because she thinks he's here to molest her or rape her, right? I take refuge in God from you. If you are God-fearing, you're going to leave me alone, right? And then he says, and I can actually, let me see if I can pull up the actual words here. So people are asking, what are the actual text words here?